Hey there. Tonight, we are stepping into a different kind of darkness. Not the darkness of dragons or battlefields you can see and name, but the darkness of ordinary rooms, unremarkable apartments, closed train platforms, and quiet radio frequencies that hummed in frequencies no civilian was meant to find. We are going somewhere that existed in the cracks of the visible world, a world built from borrowed identities, dead-end corridors, and the long, patient silence of people who were paid to disappear. If these slow, quiet stories from the hidden past help you drift gently into sleep, I am so glad you are here with me tonight. And before we go any further, a small moment of honesty. This channel, Heyo, is something I am building one story at a time. Right now, we are working toward 1,000 subscribers, and that milestone means more than you might imagine. It keeps the lights on. It keeps the stories coming. So if you are finding some calm here tonight, please consider hitting like and subscribe. Leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from, what time it is, and whether you still have a little sleepy hype to send our way. It always finds me. Now, settle in. Let the light go low. Let whatever tension is left in your shoulders find the mattress beneath you. And let us begin. The Second World War ended not with a clean silence, but with a long, complicated exhale. Cities lay in rubble. Borders had been redrawn on maps by men who had never stood in those fields. Populations had been displaced by the tens of millions. And underneath all of that visible chaos, something else was happening. Something quieter. Something that would define the next 40 years of human history in ways that most people would never fully understand. Because it was never meant to be understood. It was meant to be invisible. The great powers of the mid-20th century had discovered during the war itself that some of the most important battles were not fought with tanks and artillery. They were fought with information, with secrets, with the careful management of who knew what, and who believed what, and who could be trusted or turned or used, and then quietly discarded. The intelligence services that had grown enormous during wartime did not shrink when the peace came. They adapted. They turned their vast networks of safe houses, couriers, forged documents, and secret radio frequencies toward the new contest that was already beginning before the last shots of the old war had fully faded. What emerged was a shadow infrastructure. A second city built inside the visible one. In every major European capital, and in dozens of smaller towns and unremarkable villages, there were apartments that were not what they appeared to be. There were train stations that were closed but not empty. There were radio transmitters broadcasting coded messages from inside ordinary-looking buildings to agents who might be sitting in a kitchen in Warsaw, or a cafe in Vienna, or a farmhouse outside Helsinki. There were tunnels beneath the streets of Berlin that carried not passengers, but secrets. There were bunkers beneath luxury hotels and government ministries that were never mentioned in any public document. This is the world we are entering tonight. Slowly, quietly. The way you would enter any place that has been sealed for decades, with a little reverence for what happened here, with an understanding that the people who moved through these spaces were real people, with cold hands and dry mouths, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from never quite being able to relax, from sleeping with one ear always listening, from living inside a performance day after day, until you were no longer entirely sure where the performance ended and you began. Let the room go quiet. Let your breathing slow. And let us begin with the simplest and most elegant question at the heart of all of this. How do you hide something in plain sight? How do you build an infrastructure of secrecy inside a world that is otherwise open and crowded and full of curious eyes? The answer, it turns out, is surprisingly mundane, and perhaps that is the most interesting thing about it. The machinery of espionage, at its most fundamental level, looks almost exactly like the ordinary world. It just means something different. Think of a city, any major European city of the 1950s or 1960s. Let your mind settle into one. Vienna, perhaps. A city of grand boulevards and elaborate stone facades and coffee houses where people read newspapers and drank small cups of strong coffee and argued about philosophy and politics and the future of a continent that had recently been almost entirely destroyed. A city where the four powers of the post-war settlement sat in uneasy proximity, their embassies and missions and intelligence operations all occupying the same urban space, breathing the same cold winter air, occasionally passing each other on the same street corners. A city where the elegant surface of pre-war European civilization had been imperfectly restored over a foundation of complexity and grief and unfinished history.
Now look more carefully, not at the grand facades, at the second-floor windows of the ordinary buildings in the residential districts, at the apartments above the tobacconists and the tailors and the small grocery shops, at the buildings set back slightly from the main streets, the ones with the unremarkable entrances and the curtained windows and the quiet that settles round them in a way that is hard to explain but easy to feel. Some of those apartments had been rented through a chain of intermediaries that led eventually to a government that would deny all knowledge for purposes that were not residential in the conventional sense. The man who appeared occasionally at the front door was not a private individual. The woman who came on Thursday evenings and left before midnight was not a neighbor visiting a friend. The packages that were delivered and never seen again did not contain the things that packages in ordinary buildings contain. This is the world we are entering, not dramatically, not with a chase or a gunshot or the sudden revelation of a hidden room, just quietly through an ordinary door, up an ordinary staircase, into a room that looks like any other room and contains a history that most rooms do not.
The Cold War, at its most fundamental level, was an information war, a war about what each side knew of the other, a war about perception and deception and the management of uncertainty. The weapons that mattered most were not always the ones that could be photographed or counted or paraded down the center of a capital city on a national holiday. They were the pieces of knowledge that told you what the other side was planning, whether the missile gap was real or manufactured, whether the general who had been quietly replaced was replaced because of illness or because of a political falling out that signaled something important about the leadership's stability, whether the new weapon system that the other side was developing was as capable as their propaganda suggested or considerably less so. The infrastructure we are exploring tonight was built to answer these questions. The safe houses were the places where the people who gathered the answers rested and met and passed their information onward. The ghost stations were the visible edges of an invisible geography.
The number stations were the one-way voices in the dark that reached out across the electromagnetic spectrum to people sitting in rooms in Warsaw or Budapest or East Berlin with a receiver and a one-time pad and the practiced patience of those who have learned to wait. All of it was built to last, and most of it did not. The Cold War ended. The war came down. The empire dissolved. The listening posts went dark, and the rooms that had contained all of this history became once again just rooms, empty of their purposes, but full of their pasts. And it is to those rooms, and what happened in them, that we now turn.
A safe house, in the vocabulary of intelligence work, is not necessarily a dramatic place. It does not need to be a castle or a bunker. It does not need reinforced walls or a hidden door behind a bookshelf. In fact, the best safe houses are the ones that are completely, almost aggressively, ordinary. A second-floor apartment in a medium-density residential neighborhood. A flat above a bakery on a street that nobody particularly important ever walks down. A small house at the end of a lane in a town that does not appear on tourist maps. The less interesting the location, the better, because interesting locations attract attention, and attention in this world is the beginning of the end. The selection of a safe house was a careful process, governed by a set of practical considerations that had been refined over decades of trial and error. Access was crucial. A good safe house needed at least 2 ways in or out. Not necessarily a dramatic back door through a cellar, although those certainly existed. More often it was something simpler. A building with an entrance on one street and an exit that opened onto a different street. A ground floor unit with a window that could be exited without attracting notice. A stairwell that connected to a neighboring building through an unlocked door on the top floor. These redundancies were not paranoia. They were the basic grammar of survival in a world where the wrong person appearing at the front door meant the difference between an awkward conversation and a life sentence. Neighbors were a constant consideration. The ideal safe house was in a building where people kept to themselves. Not so isolated that a stranger coming and going would be noticed, not so sociable that the landlord's wife would bring around a cake to welcome the new tenants and stay for 3 hours asking questions. The middle range was safest. A building with 6 or 8 apartments where people nodded in the hallways and asked nothing personal. Urban anonymity was a gift. Cities like Berlin, Vienna, London, and Paris were full of buildings where you could live for years without learning the first names of the people on your floor. That indifference was worth more than any lock. Landlords were a delicate problem. In many cases, intelligence services preferred to own their properties outright, through a chain of shell companies or front organizations that could not be easily traced back to a government agency. In other cases, they rented from private landlords using cover identities. A safe house might be rented in the name of a small import-export business, a trade association, or a private individual with a plausible professional identity. The rent was always paid on time. The tenants were always polite. The garbage was always taken out. Nothing about the arrangement invited scrutiny, because scrutiny was the enemy. Inside, a safe house was typically modest, functional furniture, a kitchen with basic supplies, a radio, though not always a conspicuous one, curtains that could be closed without looking suspicious. A bathroom with a window above the cistern that, if you knew where to look, contained a false panel behind which documents or equipment could be stored. The details varied by organization and era, but the principle was consistent.
The space had to be able to pass a casual inspection. A landlord coming to fix a leaking pipe should see nothing alarming. The tradecraft was in the layers. The equipment that mattered was never in the open. It was behind the panel, under the floorboard, inside the hollowed spine of a book on the shelf. The CIA, the British Secret Intelligence Service, more commonly known as MI6, the Soviet KGB, and the East German Stasi all maintained networks of safe houses across Europe throughout the Cold War era. The exact numbers were never publicly disclosed. Declassified documents from the post-Cold War period suggest that in major European cities alone, there were dozens of properties at any given time being maintained as part of active intelligence infrastructure. Some were used regularly, for weeks or months at a time. Others were kept simply as contingencies, backup addresses that existed in case the primary location was compromised. Empty rooms waiting for a knock at the door that might come at any hour.
The turnover was significant. Safe houses had a lifespan, like most things in intelligence work. Once a property was associated with any kind of incident, or once there was any reason to believe it might be known to the opposition, it was quietly abandoned. Leases were terminated. Furniture was left or removed, depending on the cover story. The next tenant, if there was one, would never know what conversations had been whispered in those rooms, what documents had been photographed on that kitchen table, what terrified person had sat on that sofa and waited to hear whether their cover had held. Some of those rooms still exist, of course, in London, Vienna, Berlin, Paris and Rome. They have been redecorated and rented to ordinary tenants who hang pictures on the walls and stack their shoes by the door, and have absolutely no idea that the room they sleep in was once a node in a network of secrets that reached across the entirety of the Cold War world. There is something oddly comforting about that, if you think about it in the right way. History settles into the walls of things. It becomes part of the plaster, quiet and inert. You do not have to know it is there, for it to be there. The rooms remember, even when we do not.
There is a document from the CIA's declassified operational archives, released as part of the CREST program, that describes in general terms the criteria for selecting safe house properties in a major European city during the 1950s. The language is remarkably dry. It concerns itself with street width, with the proximity of public transportation, with the number of exits, with the noise levels of the surrounding neighbourhood, with the availability of parking, with the height of the property above street level, and what this means for surveillance exposure. It reads like a real estate assessment, which is exactly what it is, except that the buyer is a government agency, and the purpose is to provide secure meeting space for operations that will not be acknowledged in any public record. The mundanity of the document is its most revealing quality. This is not the language of drama or adventure. It is the language of logistics, of practical problems requiring practical solutions. The same quality of quiet professionalism appears in the training manuals that some intelligence services have partially declassified. The sections dealing with safe house operations read like a combination of property management guidelines and behavioral psychology. How to enter a safe house without attracting attention. How to behave if a landlord or neighbour makes unexpected contact. How to assess whether a property has been searched in your absence. The tiny tells that an experienced officer learns to read. A thread left across a door that has been moved. A drawer that is slightly more closed than you left it. A book that has been replaced at a fractionally different angle. The cultivation of a kind of extreme attentiveness to the ordinary that is itself a kind of art form. Noticing everything, revealing nothing. If you want to find the most literal version of the hidden world we are exploring tonight, you do not need to look behind a false panel or under a floorboard. For 30 years, you could find it simply by riding the subway in West Berlin and watching out the window. Because beneath the divided city, the ghost stations waited, dark, sealed, guarded, real. In August 1961, the East German government built the Berlin Wall. Within hours, the physical division of the city was complete. But the city's underground railway network, the U-Bahn and the S-Bahn, had not been designed with a wall in mind. The lines ran where they had always ran, following the logic of the city as it had existed before the war. And in several cases, that logic now created an impossible situation. West Berlin transit lines, carrying ordinary commuters to ordinary destinations, ran through stretches of tunnels that lay beneath East Berlin territory. The solution adopted by the East German authorities was remarkable in its bluntness. They simply closed the stations that now fell on the wrong side of the wall. 15 underground stations were sealed. Entrances were bricked up or welded shut from the street above. The platforms were cleared of passengers and handed over to a small contingent of uniformed East German transport police, known as the Trapos, whose job was to ensure that no West Berliner on a passing train could use these stations to slip into the east. The lights were turned down, though not entirely off. The platforms were stripped of anything that might be useful. And the trains, the West Berlin trains, with their commuters reading newspapers and dozing and staring at advertisements, continued to pass through these stations, slowly, not stopping, just passing through. West Berliners, peering through train windows at these dim, frozen platforms, with their motionless guards and their silence, began to call them the Geisterbahnhöfe, the ghost stations. The name was never official. It appeared on no government document. It was simply what the people called what they saw. And what they saw was genuinely strange. Station signs that still displayed the names of streets that were now in effect in a different country. Advertising posters from the early 1960s, growing yellow and curled at the edges as the years passed because nobody came to replace them. Tile work that had been cleaned before the wall went up and never cleaned again, slowly accumulating the particular grey patina of sealed, unventilated spaces, the dust of a city that had stopped. Stations like Potsdamer Platz, Stadtmitte, Unter den Linden, Nordbahnhof, and Oranienburger Tor entered a kind of suspended animation. They did not decay dramatically the way abandoned surface buildings often do. The underground environment is stable. Temperature changes little. Humidity is consistent. And so the ghost stations simply persisted, almost unchanged, for nearly 3 decades. A clock on a platform wall stopped at the moment the station was sealed. It was still stopped 30 years later when the wall came down. A bench on a platform still bore the shape of the people who had once sat on it, the paint slightly worn in the places where hands had rested. These details were noted by the first photographers who gained access after reunification, and they carry a strange weight, not the weight of drama, but of simple frozen time. The Trapos who guarded these stations worked in pairs, always. They had small booths on the platforms, originally designed as newspaper kiosks and coffee stands, which were converted into police observation posts. From these booths they watched the passing trains and monitored the platforms and the tunnels for any sign of an escape attempt, because that, in the end, was the real function of the ghost stations. Not simply to deny West Berliners access to East Berlin territory through the underground, but to deny East Berliners a route of escape into the West.
The tunnels connecting the ghost stations to the active East Berlin network were potential escape corridors, and they were guarded accordingly.
The intelligence services of both East and West were deeply interested in these underground spaces. The tunnels of Berlin were not merely transit infrastructure, they were a map of potential. The CIA's Berlin operations base, which was among the most active and significant CIA installations of the Cold War, was keenly aware of the tunnel networks beneath the city. Several major intelligence operations made use of Berlin's underground geography. The most famous was Operation Gold, a joint CIA and MI6 project that involved digging a tunnel from the American sector in the western part of the city into East Berlin territory, where it connected to a junction of Soviet military communication cables. For 11 months in 1955 and 1956, Western intelligence agencies listened in real time to Soviet military communications traveling through cables just 12 inches above the tunnel they had dug. The operation was eventually discovered, but not before an enormous amount of intelligence had been gathered. The ghost stations themselves were not directly used for intelligence operations in the conventional sense. They were too well guarded, too exposed, too likely to create an international incident if a Western agent was found on an East German platform. But they existed as a constant reminder of what the divided city meant. They were the most visible, most literal expression of a world split in two. A world in which the ordinary had been made strange, in which you could ride a train through enemy territory without ever stepping off it, in which the past was still present, frozen and waiting, just outside the window. When the wall came down on the 9th of November 1989, the ghost stations did not open immediately. The process was gradual. Urban explorers and photographers made their way in during the brief window of administrative uncertainty in the weeks following reunification. What they found were spaces that seemed to have stopped in time. The 1961 edition of things. A city's underground memory, preserved by accident and by the particular logic of division. Most of the stations were eventually restored and reopened, cleaned and updated, folded back into the living city. But you can still see traces if you know where to look. At Nordbahnhof, now an S-Bahn station again, there are preserved sections of platform where the original tiles remain, and photographs on the walls documenting the history of the space. The ghost has been given a memorial. The memory has been folded into the present. And late at night, when the platforms are empty and the last trains have passed, it is very easy to imagine those 30 years of silence settling back over the tile and the iron and the dim, persistent dark. Vienna, in the years immediately following the Second World War, was a city of shadows. It had been divided, like Berlin, into 4 occupation zones, controlled by the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets. But unlike Berlin, which would eventually be sealed by a wall, Vienna remained a porous, complicated, electric city. A place where all 4 powers rubbed against each other in the streets and the cafes and the corridors of the grand buildings that had survived the bombing. A city where identity was slippery and the past was something that many people were actively,
urgently trying to escape. The ratlines were the escape routes of the post-war period. The word itself comes from the naval term for the lines that run up a ship's rigging, used by sailors to climb. And these ratlines climbed in their own way. They climbed out of the rubble of occupied Europe and over the borders and onto ships and into new lives in new countries. They were used with terrible moral complexity by people who had survived the war and by people who had perpetrated the war's worst crimes in roughly equal measure. Because the chaos of the post-war moment was not discriminating. People moved through it according to who they knew and who was willing to help them, and morality was sometimes the last consideration in a world that was primarily concerned with survival and strategic advantage.
The ratlines that passed through Austria, and specifically through Vienna, were the most active and most significant. The city's position at the crossroads of East and West, its history as the capital of an empire that had stretched across half of Central Europe, and the particular nature of its occupation made it the ideal transit point for people trying to move from one world to another. Safe houses along the ratlines were varied in character. Some were operated by private individuals, motivated by payment, ideology, or a mixture of both. Some were run by religious organizations. Catholic monasteries and convents across Austria, Italy, and into the Mediterranean served as rest points along routes that ultimately led to South America, the Middle East, and elsewhere. The American Counterintelligence Corps, which operated out of Vienna and the broader Austrian occupation zone in the years between 1947 and 1950, maintained its own network of safe houses for a quite different purpose. They were sheltering informants and defectors from the Soviet zone, people who had information about Soviet military dispositions, about the structure of emerging Eastern Bloc security services, about the identity of agents operating in the West. These people needed protection. They needed somewhere to stay while their information was assessed, their identities verified, their futures negotiated. The safe houses of the CIC were quiet, ordinary places, apartments and small houses in residential districts of Vienna and its surrounding towns, the kind of places where a new face would not necessarily attract attention in a city still processing hundreds of thousands of displaced persons.
The moral calculus of this period was, to put it gently, complicated. The United States Counterintelligence Corps, in its pursuit of intelligence advantage against the Soviet Union, provided protection not only to genuine defectors from the East, but in at least one documented case, helped facilitate the escape of Klaus Barbie, the former Gestapo chief of Lyon, who had been responsible for the deportation of Jewish children to Auschwitz and the torture and execution of French resistance fighters. Barbie was used as an intelligence asset, sheltered in CIC safe houses, and eventually helped to flee to Bolivia. This history is not comfortable, but it is part of the history of the spaces we are describing. The same walls that sheltered someone fleeing Soviet persecution might also have sheltered someone fleeing justice for crimes of an entirely different order. Vienna itself remained one of the most active intelligence environments in the world throughout the Cold War. The city's neutral status after 1955, when Austria signed its state treaty and declared permanent neutrality, made it an even more attractive location for intelligence operations. Neutral Vienna was a place where East and West could operate in the same city without the friction that came with direct confrontation. The Soviet embassy maintained a large intelligence apparatus. The British and Americans maintained their own, and the city's safe houses, scattered through its beautiful, melancholy streets, served as the quiet machinery of all of it. Meeting points, holding locations, places where an agent could rest for a few days when a plan was finalized, or a document forged, or a decision made about what to do next.
The coffee houses of Vienna, famously, were also nodes in this network. A city famous for its café culture provided, inadvertently, perfect cover for the kind of long, slow meetings that intelligence work requires. A man sitting alone at a corner table for 2 hours with a newspaper and a small cup of coffee was not unusual. He was Viennese. The dead drop in the hollow beneath a particular table leg in a particular café might seem like the stuff of spy fiction, but the history of Cold War operations in Vienna confirms that the mundane and the clandestine were genuinely indistinguishable in this city. The ordinary was the cover was the ordinary. Vienna's particular character as an intelligence environment persisted long after the occupation period ended in 1955. The city's permanent neutrality, enshrined in the Austrian State Treaty, made it a uniquely useful location for all sides. The Soviet Union maintained a large presence. The United States maintained a large presence. And crucially, both were constrained in certain ways by the city's neutral status, which meant that the most aggressive kinds of intelligence operations, the ones that might in another city escalate quickly into open confrontation, had to be conducted with a degree of restraint on all sides.
This restraint created an odd kind of equilibrium. Vienna became one of the most active intelligence environments in the world, while simultaneously maintaining the appearance of a graceful, slightly melancholy European city going about its cultural business. The opera was excellent, the pastries were extraordinary, the coffee was unparalleled. And in the streets around the Ringstrasse and the Naschmarkt and the old Jewish district of the Second Bezirk, an enormous amount of the Cold War's real business was being conducted by people who looked, to all appearances, like they were simply enjoying the city. Vienna understood this about itself and accommodated it with the particular Viennese quality of sophisticated incuriosity. The city had survived the Habsburg Empire, 2 world wars, 4-power occupation, and the reconfiguration of the entire European order. It could manage a few intelligence services. It always had. The safe houses of Vienna reflect this quality. They are not dramatic buildings. They are the beautiful, slightly worn residential buildings of a city that has been elegant for a very long time and wears its elegance lightly. Stone staircases that have been worn smooth by a century of footsteps. Tall windows with interior shutters that close against the sound of the street. Rooms with high ceilings and the particular acoustic quality that comes from thick plaster walls. In such a room, a conversation conducted at normal volume would not carry. In such a room, a document could be photographed or read and returned to its container without the process being visible to anyone outside. The city had built, over centuries, the perfect infrastructure for secrecy. It just had not, until the mid-20th century, fully exploited it.
There is a particular kind of silence that comes from a room that has been prepared for something that never happened. A room stocked with supplies, equipped with radio gear, mapped and memorized, and kept ready for a disaster that in the end did not come. That silence is the silence of the Gladio safe houses, the silence of the stay-behind networks, the silence of a continent that was armed and waiting for an invasion that never arrived. Operation Gladio is the name most associated with the NATO-sponsored network of stay-behind organizations that were established across Western Europe following the Second World War.
The Italian branch, codenamed Gladio, was the first to be publicly acknowledged, following a statement by Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti in 1990 that shocked Europe and opened a decade of parliamentary investigations and journalistic inquiry. But Gladio was not a uniquely Italian phenomenon. Every NATO member state had its own version of the program under various code names, coordinated and funded in large part through the intelligence services of the United States and the United Kingdom. The concept was rooted in the experience of wartime resistance. During the Second World War, the occupied countries of Europe had developed networks of resistance fighters who operated behind enemy lines, conducting sabotage, gathering intelligence, maintaining communications with the Allied command, and waiting for the moment when circumstances would allow them to rise and contribute meaningfully to liberation. The planners of the early Cold War period looked at this history and asked a simple question. What would happen if the Soviet Union invaded Western Europe and the NATO conventional forces were unable to stop the advance? What if, within weeks or months, Western Europe found itself under Soviet occupation?
The answer they developed was to pre-position the infrastructure of resistance before it was needed, to identify individuals, build networks, cache weapons and communications equipment, establish safe houses and meeting points and emergency protocols, so that if the worst happened, an organized resistance would already exist. It would not need to be built from scratch in the chaos and confusion of occupation. It would simply need to be activated. The safe houses of the Gladio networks were among the most carefully maintained and meticulously obscure properties in all of post-war Europe. They were chosen according to strict criteria. Remoteness was valued. A farmhouse at the end of a long track in a rural area of northern Italy, or a hunting lodge in the Swiss Alps, or a warehouse on the outskirts of a small Belgian town. Places where strangers could come and go without attracting the attention of neighbors. Places that could plausibly serve as transit points for goods or equipment. Places with access to the road network, but not conspicuously positioned on any major route. Beneath these properties, in many cases, the weapons caches were buried. Waterproof containers sealed in concrete vaults beneath floors or under garden beds, containing weapons, ammunition, radio equipment, and in some cases forged identity documents. These caches were mapped in documents that were themselves stored in secure facilities and accessible only to senior officers of the relevant stay-behind networks. The maps were updated periodically as caches were moved or supplemented. In some cases, the caches were never moved at all. They sat in the ground for decades, waiting.
When investigations began after 1990, some of these caches were discovered and excavated. In Italy, investigators found weapons, explosives and detonators that had been sitting in sealed containers in rural locations since the 1950s, dated but intact. The human networks that maintained these safe houses are harder to document. The individuals involved were bound by oaths of secrecy that were taken seriously and maintained with remarkable discipline. Many of them went to their graves without publicly acknowledging their involvement. Others spoke, after the Cold War ended, in carefully limited ways. What emerges from their accounts is a picture of a kind of double life. An ordinary professional existence, a job, a family, a community, lived alongside a parallel existence defined by occasional training exercises, periodic meetings in remote locations, and the persistent background awareness that at any moment the alert might come, that the scenario for which they had spent years preparing might actually be happening.
There were dentists in northern Italy who were also weapons cache custodians. shopkeepers in Belgium, who served as communication relay points, school teachers in West Germany, who had received paramilitary training and knew the locations of buried equipment that they had not visited in years, but could still find in the dark if they had to. These people were not, for the most part, adventurers or extremists. They were ordinary people who had been recruited at a particular moment in their lives, who had said yes to something that seemed important and necessary, and who had then gone back to their ordinary lives and carried this parallel existence alongside the visible one for years or decades without telling anyone. Not their spouses, in many cases, not their children. The secret was the thing they lived inside, and over time, for many of them, it became simply a room they had forgotten was there. It never happened. The Soviet invasion that the stay-behind networks were designed to resist never came. And so the safe houses sat waiting, the weapons sat in the ground, the radio frequencies sat silent, and the men and women who had been recruited and trained and equipped for a war that did not arrive grew older, and the whole apparatus accumulated the particular melancholy of something that was never needed, a preparation that was in the end preparation for nothing.
The controversy that surrounds Gladio in the historical record concerns not the original defensive purpose, but the allegations that portions of the stay-behind network were diverted, particularly in Italy and to a lesser extent in other countries, toward domestic political operations, the so-called strategy of tension, the use of violence or the threat of violence to manipulate political outcomes, to discredit left-wing political movements, to keep centrist and right-wing governments in power. The Piazza Fontana bombing in Milan in 1969, which killed 17 people, and the Bologna train station massacre of 1980, which killed 85 people, are among the events that have been examined in this context. The evidence is complex and contested. Courts convicted neo-fascist groups for several attacks, but the question of institutional knowledge and institutional involvement has never been fully or satisfactorily resolved. What is not contested is that the infrastructure existed, the safe houses existed, the weapons caches existed, the networks existed. Whether that infrastructure was used only for its stated defensive purpose or also for purposes that were darker and closer to home is a question that the historical record has answered only partially. Some of the silence will remain. Section 6. The CIA's European Station Houses, London, Frankfurt and beyond. The Central Intelligence Agency, established in 1947 from the remnants of the wartime Office of Strategic Services, moved with remarkable speed to build the infrastructure it would need for the intelligence contest of the Cold War. Europe was the primary theatre, Berlin was the front line, but the network spread across the continent, from the British Isles to the Turkish border. A web of stations, bases, safe houses and communication nodes that constituted one of the most extensive intelligence infrastructures ever assembled in peacetime. The CIA's official stations operated out of American embassies under the diplomatic cover that such arrangements provided. The station chief was typically listed as a senior diplomatic official. The officers under them had cover identities suited to the size and nature of the host country's mission. But parallel to the official stations and entirely separate from them in most operational respects were the bases, the field installations that handled the most sensitive operations, the places where things happened that could not be acknowledged. Frankfurt am Main in West Germany became one of the most important CIA operational hubs in Europe.
The city's position in the American occupation zone, its excellent communications infrastructure, and the large American military presence there made it a natural location for intelligence operations. The CIA's Frankfurt base maintained a number of properties in and around the city for operational use. Some were used for debriefing defectors and walk-ins, people who had come in from the cold on their own initiative, offering information in exchange for safety and sometimes money. Others were used for meetings with agents who operated in East Germany and the broader Soviet bloc. The tradecraft of these meetings was elaborate and careful. An agent coming in from the east for a face-to-face contact would be moved through a series of recognition signals and route checks before being brought to a safe house that he had never seen before and would probably never see again.
The London station, operating out of the embassy on Grosvenor Square, had a particularly close relationship with its British counterpart organisations. The CIA and MI6 shared intelligence and, in some operational contexts, resources. Safe houses in London maintained by the CIA were sometimes made available to joint operations. Properties in the quieter residential neighbourhoods of Kensington, Bayswater and Marylebone, where a furnished flat could be rented without attracting particular notice, served as meeting points for operations that required the kind of discretion that official embassy premises could not provide. The relationship between the CIA and its host countries was not always frictionless. In France, the political sensitivities of the Fourth and then the Fifth Republic meant that American intelligence operations had to be conducted with particular care. The French intelligence services had their own robust institutional culture and were not always entirely welcoming of American involvement in French affairs. Safe houses maintained by the CIA in Paris were typically operated under deeper cover than those in London or Frankfurt. The properties were rented through chains of intermediaries that were difficult to connect back to any American institution. What these properties shared was a particular quality of intentional invisibility. They were not remarkable. They did not call attention to themselves. They were furnished functionally and maintained regularly. The neighbours, if they thought about the flat at all, thought of it as occupied by quiet professional people who travelled frequently. The kind of people who were always coming and going at odd hours. The kind of people who said good morning and then went inside and closed the door. In a European city of the 1950s or 1960s, this description applied to hundreds of thousands of perfectly ordinary professionals. It was perfect cover.
Some of these properties have been identified through declassified documents and the memoirs of former officers. Others remain known only to the agencies that operated them. The CIA has declassified significant portions of its Cold War operational history, particularly through documents released under the CREST program at the National Archives. But the safe house addresses of active operations are among the details that are typically redacted, even in declassified materials. The logic is understandable. A safe house address, even from 50 years ago, reveals sources and methods in ways that can still have consequences. So the addresses remain mostly blank in the historical record. We know the neighbourhoods. We know the cities. We know the general character of the properties that were used, but the specific flat at the specific address on the specific street, where a specific officer met a specific agent on a specific night in November 1962 or March 1968, remains in most cases unknown. The rooms have been repainted, the floorboards have been replaced, the building has been sold 3 times and converted into offices or divided into smaller units. The physical space remains, somewhere in a European city, going about its ordinary life. The history it contains is invisible, folded into the plaster, silent as everything else we carry that we cannot show.
The CIA's Frankfurt base, which was, during the 1950s and 1960s,
one of the most operationally active installations in the entire American intelligence apparatus, occupied at various times several different properties in and around the city. The scale of the operation was substantial, not just the safe houses used for agent meetings, but the technical support infrastructure, the communications facilities, the document production sections, the personnel who moved through the system, processing intelligence and maintaining cover stories, and doing the enormous amount of administrative work that any large bureaucracy generates, even when that bureaucracy is a clandestine intelligence organization. There were personnel who did nothing but maintain the fleet of cars and the cover documentation for the people who drove them. There were analysts who read and processed the product that came in from the field. There were support staff who cooked meals and maintained buildings and answered telephones in ways that supported the cover identities of the whole operation. A safe house is one room, an intelligence base is a small village, and Frankfurt in the early Cold War period contained one of the largest of those invisible villages in the Western world. Section 7. Soviet safe houses and KGB residencies.
The Soviet intelligence apparatus that operated in Western Europe during the Cold War was organized around the concept of the Residenture, the residency, the KGB station embedded within a Soviet embassy or consulate, responsible for all intelligence operations in the host country and its surrounding region. The resident, the station chief, was typically listed as a senior diplomat or a trade representative or a cultural attaché. His officers were scattered through the embassy staff under similar cover identities. And beyond the official premises, extending out into the city and the country beyond, was a network of properties and contacts that constituted the operational infrastructure of Soviet intelligence in that territory. The KGB also maintained what were called illegal residentures, networks run not through the embassy, but through agents who had no official connection to the Soviet state at all. People who had been sent to Western countries years or even decades before their operations began, under cover identities so thoroughly constructed that they had verifiable histories, language skills without accent, professional credentials, social networks, and lives that bore no detectable relationship to the Soviet Union. These were the illegals, the deep cover officers, and the safe houses they used were correspondingly deep in the fabric of ordinary life.
In Paris, which was one of the most significant operational environments for Soviet intelligence in Western Europe throughout the Cold War, the KGB maintained a substantial presence. The city's large and politically active Communist Party provided both cover and a pool of potential sympathizers and recruits. The safe houses of the KGB Paris network were spread across the city, from working-class neighborhoods on the eastern edge to bourgeois residential areas on the western side. The diversity was deliberate. No single neighborhood, no single social class, no single type of property was associated exclusively with Soviet operations. The network was varied enough to be difficult to pattern match against. In Rome, the situation was similar. Italy's strong Communist Party, the largest in Western Europe for most of the Cold War period, provided a political environment in which Soviet intelligence could operate with a degree of social cover that was not available in countries with weaker left-wing movements. The KGB's Italian network maintained safe houses and meeting points in Rome and in several other major Italian cities. These properties were used for meetings with agents recruited from Italian political parties, trade unions, media organizations, and academia. The range of recruitment was broad, reflecting the KGB's understanding that influence was most valuable when it permeated institutions rather than simply extracting specific pieces of intelligence.
The East German Ministry for State Security, the Stasi,
which was in many respects the most systematically thorough domestic surveillance apparatus in the history of the modern state, also maintained a significant foreign intelligence operation. The foreign intelligence arm of the Stasi, known as the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, or HVA, was headed for many years by Markus Wolf, a man of considerable operational sophistication who built networks in West Germany and elsewhere that penetrated government ministries, NATO headquarters, and the upper reaches of West German politics. The safe houses maintained by the HVA in West Germany were run with particular care because the shared language and culture of East and West Germany made identification of East German agents easier in some respects than the identification of agents from more obviously foreign countries. A Soviet agent in West Germany might be betrayed by an accent or a cultural unfamiliarity. An East German agent was, in many cases, indistinguishable. The properties used by the Stasi's foreign intelligence network in West Germany were carefully selected and maintained. Many were in the Rhineland, in the cities and towns of North Rhine-Westphalia and Lower Saxony, which were close to the border and had good road access for agents moving between East and West. Others were in Bonn, which was the capital of West Germany throughout the Cold War period, and in Frankfurt, Munich, and Hamburg. The Stasi's operational files, which constitute one of the most extraordinary archives in the history of intelligence, contain records of many of these properties, though the full extent of the network remains a subject of ongoing historical research.
The Stasi's domestic surveillance files, the Rosenholz files, and the partial operational records that have been processed by the Bundesbauauftragte, the German authority responsible for managing the Stasi archive, have revealed an apparatus of extraordinary scope. At its height, the Stasi had approximately 100,000 full-time employees and a network of informal collaborators, the inoffizielle Mitarbeiter, that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The safe houses of the domestic operation are almost uncountable. Every town in East Germany had them. They were the places where informants met their handlers, where sensitive conversations were conducted away from workplaces and homes that might be observed, where the machinery of a surveillance state conducted its quiet, persistent business. One detail that emerges from the Stasi archive is particularly striking in its ordinariness. The safe houses used for meetings between handlers and informants were typically referred to in internal documents simply as Konspirative Wohnungen, or conspiratorial apartments. They were often ordinary rented flats, paid for by the Stasi through arrangements with state housing authorities. They were furnished modestly, in the style of any East German apartment of the period. They had the standard East German furniture, the pale wood wardrobes and the small upholstered chairs, and the kitchen with its narrow windows and its institutional-grade fixtures. Nothing about them, to a casual visitor, would have suggested their purpose. And yet, in these rooms, tens of thousands of conversations took place between informants and their handlers, conversations that determined careers and reputations and freedoms, and, in the worst cases, fates. The apartment was a stage, the furniture was props, and the people sitting across from each other in those unremarkable chairs were performing, whether they knew it or not, one of the most intimate rituals of the surveillance state.
What the Stasi understood, and what all of the organizations we have been discussing understood, is that secrecy is not primarily a technical problem. It is a human one. A room can be made secure by technical means. Signals can be encrypted. Documents can be hidden. But the fundamental vulnerability of any intelligence system is the people who operate it. The people who know where the safe houses are, who know the frequencies, who know the names. Keeping those people loyal, keeping them careful, keeping them from making the small human errors that lead to exposure was the hardest problem in intelligence work, harder than any technical challenge. And the safe houses, in a way, were one of the tools used to address it. Isolated spaces where sensitive information could be handled without the exposure that the open world would bring. Rooms designed not just to conceal, but to protect the people inside them. The architecture of trust. Section 8. The Forgotten Listening Posts. Ghost Stations of the Airwaves. Not all ghost stations have platforms and tiles and frozen clocks. Some of them existed in the electromagnetic spectrum, in the frequencies between the commercial broadcasts that ordinary people listened to, in the parts of the radio dial that most people did not know existed, or if they did, that they could not understand. The number stations, the signals intelligence facilities, the listening posts built on hills and in forests and inside ordinary-looking buildings, their real function invisible to everyone who passed them on the street.
Teufelsberg, which translates from German as Devil's Mountain, is a hill in the western part of Berlin. It is not a natural hill. It is built on the rubble of the Second World War, on the remains of a never-completed Nazi military technical college that was too solid to demolish after the war and was instead buried under the debris of the bombed city. By the 1950s, the rubble had formed a substantial elevation, the highest point in the Berlin area. And on top of it, the American National Security Agency constructed one of the most significant signals intelligence facilities of the Cold War. Field Station Berlin, as it was formerly known, operated from the early 1960s until the reunification of Germany in 1990. Its purpose was to intercept Soviet and East German military and government communications. The facility's position on the highest ground in the Berlin area, combined with the particular geography of the Cold War division, made it an extraordinarily effective listening post. From Teufelsberg, NSA equipment could intercept communications from a vast arc of East German and Soviet military territory. Aircraft communications, military radio traffic, telephone calls on certain frequencies, the electronic chatter of a military apparatus that was never entirely quiet. The station's white radomes, the distinctive geodesic spheres that housed the antenna equipment and protected it from weather, were a visible feature of the Berlin skyline for 3 decades. They were not secret exactly. Their existence was known, their location was known, but their function and capabilities were classified at the highest levels. The equipment inside those domes was among the most sophisticated signals intelligence technology in the world.
The personnel who staffed the station worked in shifts around the clock 7 days a week, monitoring frequencies and recording intercepts and passing the most significant intelligence upward through chains of command that eventually reached the highest levels of the American government. The spy at the heart of the station's most significant security failure was a man named James W. Hall. Between 1982 and 1985, Hall, an American signals intelligence soldier stationed at Teufelsberg, removed classified NSA documents from the facility and passed them to the Stasi and the KGB. He concealed the documents in a bag with a false bottom and received, over the course of his betrayal, approximately $300,000. He was caught in 1988 and sentenced to 40 years in prison. The case was a reminder that even the most secure facilities, even the ones surrounded by guards and electronics and careful protocols, were vulnerable to the oldest intelligence tool of all: a human being with a need and someone willing to meet it.
After reunification, Field Station Berlin was closed. The technology was removed. The staff departed. And Teufelsberg, which had been built on rubble, was left to return to a different kind of ruin. The buildings on the site, emptied of their equipment, were left to the weather and the urban explorers, who discovered them in the 1990s and have been climbing through them ever since. The radomes still stand, though they are deteriorating. The floors are soft with moisture. The walls are covered in graffiti. The space has been partially converted in recent years into an art space and tourist attraction, though it operates in a state of deliberate incompleteness, never quite finished, never quite functional, hovering between ruin and renovation. There is a particular beauty to it if you can visit on a quiet day. The hill itself is green and quiet, popular with dog walkers and families with bicycles. And above the trees, the white domes still float, strange and round against the Berlin sky, a monument to the listening that defined an era, a ghost station of the airwaves, now silent, now visible.
The numbers stations were something else entirely. They broadcast not from prominent hilltops, but from hidden transmitters whose locations were rarely publicly known and never officially acknowledged. A numbers station is a shortwave radio broadcast consisting of a sequence of numbers, letters, or phonetic codes, read by a human voice or generated electronically, transmitted at scheduled times on predetermined frequencies, and decipherable only by the agent who holds the relevant one-time pad. The transmission is one way. The agent receives the message, but sends nothing in return. The intelligence service that broadcast the station had no way of knowing whether their agent had heard it, whether their agent was still free, whether their agent was still alive. The broadcast went out into the air and was either received or it was not, and the silence that followed was identical in either case. The Lincolnshire Poacher was a British number station that broadcast from a transmitter believed to have been located in Cyprus, serving British agents in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Its distinctive opening call sign, a few bars of the traditional English folk song from which it took its nickname, became familiar to shortwave listeners across Europe and the Middle East, though most who heard it had no idea what they were listening to. The station broadcast for decades before going silent in 2008. Its exact operational history remains classified.
UVB-76, known to its listeners as the Buzzer, is a Russian numbers station that has been broadcasting continuously since the 1970s. Its signal, a repetitive buzzing tone punctuated occasionally by voice messages in Russian, has been monitored by shortwave enthusiasts around the world for decades. Its physical location has been tracked to a military installation in the Pavarova area near Moscow, though the facility has moved at least once. The purpose of the continuous tone is not entirely clear. Theories include its use as a military communications channel, a channel for activating sleeper agents, or a component of a dead man switch system related to nuclear launch protocols. None of these theories have been officially confirmed. The station continues to broadcast. Section 9. Dead letterboxes and the streets that carried secrets. The safe house was a fixed point, a place to go, a place to wait, a place to meet sometimes, face to face, which was always the most dangerous kind of meeting, because it required two people to be in the same location at the same time, a coincidence that the opposition could exploit if it knew about the meeting in advance. The ideal operation ran almost entirely without such meetings, without any moment when an agent and a handler had to look at each other in a room and hand something over. The infrastructure that made this possible was the dead letterbox, the dead drop, the oldest tradecraft in the world, refined over decades of Cold War practice into something almost elegant.
A dead drop is a location where one person leaves something, a document, a film canister, a container of microfilm, a message, for another person to collect later. The two people never meet, they never speak, they never even need to be in the same city at the same time, though usually the drops were local enough that the turnaround was measured in hours or days rather than weeks. The art of the dead drop was in the selection of the location. It needed to be a place that both parties could access without attracting attention. It needed to be a place where the object left would not be accidentally discovered by a third party. It needed to be a place that could be used once or a small number of times before being abandoned. The streets of Cold War Europe were threaded through with these invisible markers. A particular loose brick at the base of a garden wall in a Berlin suburb, a hollow in a tree at the edge of a public park in Vienna, the underside of a specific park bench in a residential square in London, a recess beneath a particular step in the stairwell of an apartment building in Prague. These locations existed only in the shared knowledge of the agent and the handler. They were not written down in any document that could be found and read. They were memorized, committed to the kind of deep memory that does not fade because it cannot afford to fade.
The signalling systems that accompanied dead drops were equally invisible to the uninitiated. A chalk mark on a particular wall meant that a drop had been made and was ready to collect. A thumbtack in a telephone pole meant that the drop had been collected safely. A torn piece of tape on a lamp post meant that something had gone wrong and the meeting should be aborted. To anyone walking past, these signals were invisible. A scuff on a wall, a thumbtack that someone had stuck into a pole for reasons of their own, a piece of tape that had been there for weeks. The streets spoke in a language that only two people in the world could read. The safe houses connected to this system served as the planning points, the preparation rooms, the places where documents were prepared for dropping and materials collected from drops were examined and processed. An officer would return from a street drop with a small container and take it to a safe house where it could be opened and examined without the exposure that working with sensitive materials in a hotel room or a car would involve. The safe house was the still point around which the motion of tradecraft revolved.
Some of the specific dead drop locations used during the Cold War have been documented in declassified materials and in the memoirs of former officers. The locations used by FBI traitor Robert Hanssen, who passed secrets to Soviet intelligence for more than 2 decades before his arrest in 2001, have been described in some detail in court documents. Hanssen's drops were in the Virginia suburbs of Washington, in parks and beneath wooden bridges along walking trails, in the kind of unremarkable semi-rural spaces that are passed every day by dog walkers and joggers and families with children, who have no idea that the log they are sitting on to eat their sandwiches was once, recently, the site of a passage of some of the most sensitive intelligence in the possession of the United States government. Hanssen's case is instructive in another way. He ran his operation for more than 20 years, from 1979 until his arrest in February 2001, and in all that time he maintained his cover not through any particularly sophisticated tradecraft, but through the very ordinary qualities of a man who was considered reliable, if difficult. He was a senior FBI official, he attended church, he was known in his community, he was invisible because he was present, familiar, embedded in exactly the kind of visible, legible life that makes a person seem safe to the people around them. The safe house of Robert Hanssen was, in a sense, his entire identity. His entire daily existence was the cover. There was no separate safe house. There was just a man who went to work and came home, and occasionally left a piece of tape on a lamppost in a Virginia park, and everything in between was the concealment.
The physical simplicity of the tradecraft is part of what makes it so haunting. These were not sophisticated technological systems. They were holes in the ground and marks on walls and hollow trees in public parks. The technology of the Cold War intelligence world was often spectacularly advanced. The satellite reconnaissance systems, the cryptographic machinery, the signals intelligence facilities. But the final link in the chain, the moment when intelligence moved from one human being to another, was ancient and low-tech and almost undetectable. A dead tree in a park, a loose brick, a chalk line, the city as cipher. And behind every dead drop, usually, was a safe house, the place where the materials were prepared and processed, the place where the film was developed or the documents were photographed, the place where the intelligence product was converted from its raw form into something that could be passed up the chain. The dead drop and the safe house were not separate systems. They were two parts of the same system. The drop was the point of transmission. The house was the point of preparation and analysis. Together they constituted a node in a network that stretched on both sides across the entirety of the Cold War world. Section 10. Safe houses of the defectors, sheltering those who crossed. There is a particular kind of person who arrives at the door of a safe house with nothing but what they are wearing and a piece of knowledge that might be worth their life and the lives of everyone they have ever known. They are the defectors, the people who chose to cross, who took everything they had built and everything they had become in the service of one side and offered it to the other, for reasons that were sometimes ideological, sometimes personal, sometimes financial, sometimes a mixture of all three, in proportions that were difficult to separate. Sheltering a defector was one of the most delicate operations in the intelligence world. The person who arrived had immense potential value. They might know the names of agents operating against the West, the structure of intelligence services, the content of sensitive communications, the details of military planning. All of that potential value had to be extracted carefully,
over days and weeks and sometimes months of painstaking debriefing. And while the extraction was happening, the defector had to be kept safe. Safe from the service they had left, which would desperately want to recover them, or, failing recovery, to eliminate them. Safe from the host country's press and public, whose interest in a high-profile defector could compromise the intelligence being gathered before it was fully analyzed. Safe, sometimes, from themselves.
The safe houses used for defector debriefings were chosen with particular care. They were typically outside major urban centers, in rural or semi-rural locations, where surveillance of the property would be conspicuous, and where the defector could be kept isolated without this being obvious. The British had a number of properties used for this purpose in the English countryside, in the counties south and west of London. Houses that appeared from the outside to be ordinary farmhouses or country cottages, and that were staffed by a small team of intelligence officers and support personnel. The American equivalent, in the context of defectors brought to the United States, were similarly modest properties in rural Virginia and Maryland. Oleg Gordievsky, perhaps the most significant Western intelligence asset inside the KGB during the Cold War, was not a defector in the conventional sense. He did not walk in from the cold. He was a recruited agent, a KGB officer who had been working for British intelligence since 1974, all while rising through the KGB hierarchy. When his cover was compromised in 1985, the extraction that followed was one of the most dramatic operations of the Cold War. Gordievsky, recalled to Moscow from his posting in London and subjected there to an interrogation that left him deeply shaken, managed to evade his KGB watchers and reach a prearranged contact point in Moscow. The exfiltration that followed, codenamed Pimlico, involved MI6 officers driving him in a car trunk across the Soviet border into Finland.
Once in the West, Gordievsky was taken to a series of safe houses for debriefing. The locations of these properties were never publicly disclosed and remain protected decades later. What is known is that he was debriefed extensively for several weeks immediately following his escape, and that the intelligence he provided had immediate and significant operational consequences. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, acting on intelligence from Gordievsky's debriefing, ordered the expulsion of 25 Soviet intelligence officers from the United Kingdom. The information Gordievsky had provided about Soviet perceptions of Western intentions had already, in an earlier period, contributed to the de-escalation of the Able Archer nuclear war scare of 1983, when Gordievsky's warnings about Soviet fears of a Western first strike helped prevent what might otherwise have become a catastrophic misunderstanding. Gordievsky went on to live in England under a protected identity, in a house whose address was known to very few people, for the rest of his life. He died in March 2025, in England, at the age of 86. His death was not treated as suspicious. He had lived with a death sentence hanging over him for 4 decades, sentenced to death in absentia by Russia for treason. He outlasted the Soviet Union that sentenced him. He outlasted the Cold War that defined his life. And the houses where he lived out that extraordinary protected existence were, by all accounts, entirely ordinary. Semi-detached houses in English suburbs, houses with gardens and neighbours and a local pub within walking distance. Houses that looked from the outside like every other house on the street. The best kind of safe house. The invisible kind.
Other defectors had different experiences of the infrastructure built to protect them. Anatoly Golitsyn, a KGB officer who defected to the CIA in Helsinki in December 1961, was perhaps the most controversial defector of the Cold War era. He was housed, debriefed, and eventually settled in the United States,
and his testimony shaped CIA counterintelligence analysis for decades in ways that were deeply damaging to American intelligence operations. Golitsyn claimed that there was a high-level Soviet mole inside the CIA, and the counterintelligence chief, James Angleton, became so convinced of this that he effectively paralyzed CIA operations against the Soviet Union for years, destroying the careers of multiple innocent officers in a mole hunt that produced no confirmed penetration of the CIA itself. The safe houses where Golitsyn was debriefed became, in the history of Cold War intelligence, the rooms where some of the most consequential and most questionable analysis of the era was produced. The debriefing of a defector is an intensely intimate process. A small room, usually, 2 or 3 people, usually, a single voice, the defectors, producing a stream of recollections and assessments and allegations that the debriefers must evaluate in real time, without the benefit of the corroborating evidence that will only emerge much later. The quality of the room, the quality of the relationship between the debriefer and the defector, the quality of attention that is brought to the process, all of these things affect what comes out of it. A safe house is not a neutral space. It shapes what happens inside it.
The CIA eventually settled many of its defectors in ordinary communities under new identities, with financial support sufficient to allow them to live inconspicuously, but not lavishly. These were not witness protection arrangements in the formal American legal sense, but they had some of the same characteristics: a new name, a new history, a new neighborhood where nobody knew who you had been. The safe house, in these cases, became not a temporary refuge, but a permanent condition. The defector's entire life became the cover. The address changed, but the principle remained the same. Remain invisible. Look ordinary. Trust the unremarkable. Beneath the ordinary world of roads and buildings and the daily commerce of cities, governments had dug their deepest secrets: the bunkers, the continuity facilities, the underground rooms designed not for intelligence operations, but for survival, for the preservation of government and command infrastructure through a nuclear exchange that, throughout the Cold War, felt more plausible in some years than in others, but never entirely impossible. The Greenbrier Resort in White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia, is one of the most elegant hotels in the eastern United States. It sits in the Allegheny Mountains, surrounded by golf courses and formal gardens, and has been welcoming presidents, senators, and wealthy travelers since 1778. It is a place of considerable beauty: manicured lawns, white-columned buildings, the particular unhurried atmosphere of an institution that has existed long enough to be confident in its own permanence. It is also the location of one of the most extraordinary government secrets of the Cold War. Beginning in 1959 and completed in 1962, the United States government constructed, beneath the Greenbrier's West Virginia wing, a facility designated Project Greek Island. The bunker was enormous, 112,000 square feet, excavated from the mountainside. Dormitory rooms capable of housing all 535 members of Congress. A hospital, a communications center equipped to broadcast to the American public following a nuclear attack. Decontamination facilities, a power plant, a water supply, everything needed to sustain the legislative branch of the American government for 60 days following a nuclear strike on Washington. The facility was maintained in a state of constant readiness for 30 years. Government employees posed as resort staff, responsible for maintaining the mechanical systems and the supplies. Congress members who stayed at the Greenbrier over those decades were, for the most part, entirely unaware that beneath the building they were sleeping in, their government had prepared a room for them to survive the end of the world. The secret was maintained with remarkable effectiveness until 1992, when a journalist named Ted Gupp published an article in the Washington Post that described the facility in detail. The government decommissioned the bunker immediately upon publication. The secret, once out, could not be managed. The facility was opened to tours and is now a museum, its blast doors and dormitory rooms open to the visitors who were never supposed to know it existed.
In the United Kingdom, the equivalent was Burlington, a facility excavated from the limestone beneath Corsham in Wiltshire. Burlington was designed as the seat of British government in the event of nuclear war. At its height, the facility covered 35 acres underground and was equipped to house 4,000 government personnel, including the Prime Minister, cabinet members, and essential civil service staff. It had its own BBC studio, from which emergency broadcasts to the surviving population could be made. It had a pub, apparently considered essential to the morale of any body of British officials condemned to spend weeks underground. Burlington was decommissioned in the 1990s, and its existence was partially declassified. It remains largely intact beneath the Wiltshire countryside, a vast underground city that was built at enormous expense and enormous effort and never used for its intended purpose. Its tunnels extend for miles beneath the fields above. Its rooms are empty and dark and cold, with the particular cold of the deep underground. A government in waiting that was never called. These facilities represent the extreme end of the safe house concept. Not a borrowed apartment in a European city, but a purpose-built underground infrastructure designed to sustain the machinery of democracy through catastrophe. They share with the humbler safe houses of intelligence work the same quality of intentional invisibility. They were in plain sight, at least in the sense that the buildings above them were known. But their real nature, their real function, the whole extraordinary apparatus they contained, was invisible, hidden in the most literal way possible. Underground. Section 12. Forgotten resistance safe houses, from war to Cold War.
There is a particular kind of building that carries two histories simultaneously. The house that hid partisans during the German occupation, and then, a decade later, in a different political climate with different occupants, hid intelligence officers conducting operations against a different kind of threat. The continuity is not always obvious. The second use often had no knowledge of the first. But the buildings themselves exist at the intersection of both histories, and the people who know them well sometimes feel that weight. The networks built by the Special Operations Executive, the British wartime organization responsible for conducting sabotage and supporting resistance movements in occupied Europe, were in some respects the direct ancestors of the post-war intelligence networks. Many of the same people were involved, many of the same techniques were used, and in some cases the same properties. A farmhouse in Normandy that had sheltered SOE agents in 1943 might, with different occupants and a different mandate, serve a similar function in the 1950s for an operation directed not at Nazi Germany, but at Soviet intelligence. The SOE had built its European networks under conditions of extraordinary difficulty. The occupied countries of Europe were surveilled, suspicious environments where any unfamiliar face was potentially dangerous and any mistake could mean arrest, torture, and death. The safe houses used by SOE agents and the resistance networks they supported were typically offered by private individuals, often at enormous personal risk. A French farmer who hid an SOE wireless operator in a barn was risking his life and the lives of his family. A Belgian shopkeeper who provided cover documentation at a room above the shop for a Jewish family and a British agent was operating with the full understanding of what discovery would mean.
Some of these people were still alive in the late 1940s and 1950s, when the new intelligence networks were being built.
Some of them were recruited again, this time to serve in the Cold War resistance infrastructure. Their wartime experience was exactly what was needed. They knew how to maintain cover, how to deflect curious neighbors, how to live with the constant low-level anxiety of concealment without breaking. They were, in the language of tradecraft, proven. Their reliability had been demonstrated under the worst possible conditions. The properties they offered were similarly proven. A barn that had concealed people successfully for 3 years during the German occupation had demonstrated its worth. A basement that had escaped 5 searches by the Gestapo had proved its usefulness in concrete, empirical terms. These were not theoretical safe houses. They were safe houses with track records. And in a world where the consequences of failure were as severe as they had ever been, track records mattered. The continuity extended into the mythology of the networks as well. The resistance of the wartime period had been idealized, particularly in France and the Netherlands and Belgium, into a story of national heroism and moral clarity. The men and women who had sheltered agents and hidden weapons and transmitted intelligence under occupation were celebrated as patriots. The stay-behind networks of the Cold War drew on this mythology deliberately. The narrative that was offered to recruits was not a neutral professional one. It was a continuation of resistance, a continuation of the fight against occupation and tyranny, now in a different form, against a different enemy.
Whether that narrative was accurate is another question. The moral clarity of wartime resistance against Nazi occupation was not easily transferred to the more ambiguous world of Cold War intelligence politics. But the narrative served a function. It gave the safe houses and the networks and the caches of weapons a meaning that extended beyond the merely strategic. It placed them in a story that had already been told and already ended well. It made the extraordinary seem not merely necessary but noble. Some of these dual history properties still exist in the European countryside. Farmhouses in France and Belgium where, if you know where to look, you can find the modifications that were made in 2 different eras for 2 different purposes. A trapdoor that was installed during the occupation and used again in the 1950s. A false wall in a cellar that is thicker than it needs to be. A chimney with a slightly irregular interior. The buildings are old enough now that most of what they contain is history and nothing else. The networks they served have long been dissolved. But the modifications remain in the walls, waiting for someone who knows how to look. There is something profound, if you sit with it long enough, about this continuity of hidden purpose across different historical eras. A building has no ideology. It conceals what it is asked to conceal. A priest hole built into an English country house in the 16th century to hide Catholic clergy from Protestant authorities might 300 years later serve as a hiding place for a different kind of fugitive in a different kind of danger. The building does not discriminate. The hiding space simply is. It waits in the same patient way that all structural accommodations wait, for whoever needs it next.
The people who built these adaptations into their homes, who cut the trapdoors and thickened the walls and bricked up the chimneys into false configurations, were making a kind of wager. A wager that there would be people who needed hiding and ideologies, and the whole long catalogue of human persecution is perhaps the most telling comment on human history that any building can make. The need for a place to hide has not left us. It has simply changed its address.
And yet people crossed, not in large numbers, not easily, but consistently throughout the Cold War, from its earliest months to its final years. Some crossed legally through the official checkpoints with their document inspections and their long waits and their occasional humiliations. Some crossed illegally, using knowledge of the terrain, the timing of patrols, the weak points in surveillance coverage, the particular darkness of a moonless night in November. And some were helped to cross by networks that existed specifically to facilitate the movement of people who needed to be somewhere they were not supposed to be. The safe houses along the border crossing routes were some of the most carefully selected properties in the entire intelligence infrastructure. They occupied a specific position in the landscape, close enough to the border to be useful as last-stage resting and preparation points, but not so close that they attracted the regular surveillance that the border zone itself generated. Typically, they were in the first ring of towns and villages set back from the formal border zone, places that were not militarily restricted but were within reasonable travel distance of the crossing points.
The Hungarian border with Austria, which was one of the most significant crossing points in the entire Iron Curtain during the early Cold War period, was bordered by a landscape of small farms, vineyards, and rural villages that provided natural cover for this kind of infrastructure. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956, during which a popular uprising against Soviet domination was suppressed by Soviet military intervention, produced an enormous flow of refugees toward the Austrian border. In the weeks following the Soviet intervention, approximately 200,000 Hungarians crossed into Austria. The safe houses and reception points along the Austrian side of the border that processed this human flood were working at a scale they had never been designed to handle. But the organized crossings, the planned ones, the ones that served intelligence purposes rather than purely humanitarian ones, were more carefully managed. An agent being moved from east to west, or in some cases from west to east, would follow a route that was planned in advance, passing through a series of relay points. Each point had people who knew only the next step in the route and the previous step. No one along the chain knew the whole journey. No one could betray what they did not know. The safe house at each relay point received the traveller, provided a night's rest and a meal, and, if needed, a change of documentation, and passed them on.
The Berlin tunnels, several of which were dug during the early 1960s before the wall hardened sufficiently to make tunnel escape extremely difficult, represent a particular category of crossing infrastructure. These were not safe houses in the conventional sense, but the network of people and properties that supported the tunnel operations had the same character. The people who dug the tunnels, who concealed the digging, who received the people who came through from the other side, all used a network of ordinary properties in ordinary neighborhoods to do this work. Basements where the digging started, apartments where people waited, addresses that were never supposed to appear on any document connected to any tunnel. Some of the most significant tunnels were dug by students, young people, motivated by a combination of idealism and the very personal fact of friends and family members who were now on the other side of the wall. The amateur quality of some of these operations, the improvised infrastructure, the necessarily tight circles of trust, made them in some respects harder for the East German security services to detect than the more sophisticated operations of professional intelligence organizations.
The border crossings, the tunnels, the forest paths, the hidden boats on the Baltic coast, all of these were supported by the same kind of ordinary, invisible infrastructure. Safe houses that looked like any other house on the street, people who looked like any other person in the village. The concealment was not sophisticated, it was human. It was the ancient human skill of hiding in plain sight, of being unremarkable, of giving nothing away. In an era of satellites and signals intelligence and sophisticated surveillance technology, the most effective camouflage was still, in the end, a curtained window and a face that nobody quite noticed.
There is a frequency between 3 and 30 megahertz in the shortwave band, where the ordinary rules of radio propagation change. Shortwave signals bounce off the ionosphere and return to Earth far from their origin, potentially thousands of miles away, without the need for relay towers or satellite infrastructure. This property made shortwave radio the medium of choice for long-distance communication throughout much of the 20th century. And it made it the medium of choice for intelligence services communicating with agents in the field. A shortwave transmission from a transmitter in Cyprus could reach an agent in Romania. A transmission from a facility in Lincolnshire could reach someone in Poland. The signal asked no questions about the politics of the territory it crossed. Number stations exploited this property for one specific purpose: the delivery of encrypted messages to individual agents in a format that required no two-way communication and left no electronic trace of reception. The agent, briefed before deployment on the frequencies, times and cipher system they should use, simply turned on a shortwave receiver at the appointed time and listened. A voice, typically flat and slightly mechanical, either human or synthesized, read a sequence of 5-digit number groups. The agent copied down the numbers and then, using the one-time pad they had been given before departure, converted them into intelligible text. And then they burned the relevant page of the pad. The message had been received. The transmission was gone. The air carried no record of what had passed through it.
The physical anchors of this system were the transmitter facilities, buildings that appeared from the outside to be unremarkable. In some cases, they were military bases with obvious communication infrastructure. In others, they were ordinary-looking properties with a large antenna array that might pass for a commercial broadcasting facility. The Lincolnshire Poacher, the British number station that broadcast to agents in the Cold War period and beyond, was believed to be transmitted from a Royal Air Force facility in Cyprus, though the British government never officially confirmed this. The station's name came from the folk song used as its call sign, a few bars of an old English melody that drifted out across the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe before each broadcast. The Lincolnshire Poacher broadcast for decades. It went silent in 2008. Nobody officially announced this. There was no press release, no statement, no acknowledgement that the station had ever existed. It simply stopped. The frequencies it had used returned to silence, and anyone who had been monitoring them for years would have noticed the absence, but received no explanation. The government buildings in Cyprus from which it is believed to have broadcast continued to exist and continued to serve their official functions, whatever those were publicly. The transmitters that had carried those number groups into the ionosphere were presumably decommissioned. The one-time pads that had given those numbers meaning were presumably destroyed, as they always should have been. The chain of communication was broken at every link.
UVB-76, the Russian station known as the Buzzer, has a different character. Where the Lincolnshire Poacher broadcast in discrete sessions, the Buzzer broadcasts continuously. The buzz itself, a repetitive electronic tone, has been going since the 1970s. Occasionally, it is interrupted by a voice message in Russian, consisting of names and numbers in a standardized format.
The messages are infrequent. The silence between them is years long. But the buzz continues, every day, every hour, a constant presence on its frequency. The physical location of UVB-76 has been identified by radio hobbyists as a military installation in Russia near a small town called Poverovo, not far from Moscow. A Russian student who visited the area in 2014 described finding abandoned bunkers and military buildings, half submerged in the Russian forest, in various states of decay. The area had the quality of a place that had once been intensely purposeful and was now returning, slowly and without drama, to the ordinary world it had briefly interrupted. Fields and forest, and the quiet that comes after. Buildings becoming earth again.
The nature of UVB-76's purpose remains genuinely unclear. The most plausible explanations involve its use as a military communication channel, possibly related to the maintenance of command and control in the Russian military. Some analysts believe it is part of the infrastructure of what the Russians call the dead hand, an automated nuclear response system designed to ensure that a nuclear retaliatory strike could be launched even if the entire Soviet or Russian command structure had been destroyed in a first strike. If this is the case, then the buzz is not merely communication, it is a heartbeat, a signal that says continuously that the system is still active, still listening, still capable. The absence of the buzz would be, in this reading, the most significant thing it could say. And as long as it continues, it says nothing, and we are relieved. Section 15. The Slow Decay. Abandoned and Forgotten. There comes a moment in the life of a secret place when the secret is no longer relevant, but the place remains. The intelligence operation has ended. The agents have been recalled, or exchanged, or retired, or, in some cases, forgotten. The weapons caches have been removed or left in the ground to rust. The transmitters have been switched off, and the buildings that housed all of this, the apartments and farmhouses and listening posts and border relay stations, are left to figure out what they are now. Some were sold and returned to ordinary use without fanfare. An apartment in Vienna that had served as a KGB safe house in the 1970s was probably rented to a young professional couple in the 1980s and eventually sold to someone who renovated the kitchen. A farmhouse in northern Italy that had housed a Gladio arms cache became, after the cache was removed, simply a farmhouse again. The new owners planted a vegetable garden where the cache had been buried and grew excellent tomatoes. The building remembered nothing. The tomatoes were unaware. Others decayed. The field station at Teufelsberg in Berlin, emptied of its technology after reunification, was left to the weather. The NSA compound that had sat atop the artificial hill for 3 decades became, in the 1990s, a site for rave parties before settling into the more dignified, if equally melancholy status of a ruin in progress. The radomes still stand, their fiberglass skins deteriorating from the outside in. Inside, the floors are soft and give slightly underfoot, warning visitors that they are walking on surfaces that are no longer entirely safe. The walls are covered in layer upon layer of graffiti, each generation of urban explorers adding their names over the names of the people who came before them. The whole thing is a kind of unintentional palimpsest, a writing over and over of the same surface without erasing what was already there. The Burlington bunker beneath Wiltshire is perhaps the most extreme example of planned obsolescence. 35 acres of tunnel and chamber and infrastructure
built at enormous expense and with extraordinary secrecy, now sitting in the dark beneath the English countryside, doing nothing at all. It is maintained at a minimal level, enough to prevent structural deterioration, but it is not a functional facility. It is a very large, very expensive, very well-preserved monument to a contingency that never materialized. The dormitories where cabinet ministers were supposed to sleep during nuclear war have empty beds. The BBC studio where emergency broadcasts were to be made have empty chairs. The pub has no beer. Urban explorers who have managed to access Burlington, and this is not easy or officially permitted, describe it as an uncanny environment. The scale is disorienting. Underground spaces of this size are not natural human environments, and the combination of the vast scale and the complete silence and the darkness beyond the range of a torch produces a quality of experience that is difficult to describe in ordinary terms. The word most often used is haunted, though the people who use this word are typically the first to acknowledge that what they mean by it is not supernatural. They mean something more like heavy with the weight of human intention that never realized. A place that was built for an emergency and is still waiting, very quietly, for the emergency to arrive.
The ghost stations of Berlin are now mostly living stations again. Most of the Geisterbahnhöfe were restored and reopened following reunification, integrated back into the normal flow of the city's transit network. But the restoration was not, in every case, total. At Nordbahnhofe, a deliberate decision was made to preserve sections of the original ghost station platform, to leave the old tiles and the documentation of what this place was during the years of division. The station is now simultaneously a functioning transit hub and a memorial. People stand on the platform waiting for trains and look at photographs of the same platform as it was during the years when no trains stopped. The present and the past occupy the same space, which is, in a way, the most honest possible account of what history actually is.
The photographs that exist of the ghost stations during the brief window of access in 1989 and 1990, before restoration began in earnest, are among the most extraordinary historical photographs of the Cold War period. Not because they show dramatic events, they show nothing dramatic at all. They show empty platforms. They show tile work and signs and benches that have been sitting undisturbed for nearly 30 years. They show the particular quality of light in an underground space where the bulbs have not been changed in a decade. They show clocks stopped at arbitrary times. They show the posters of 1961 still on the walls, the colours faded to a pale, ambiguous yellowish grey. They show the absolute stillness of a space that was designed for human movement and has seen none for a generation. They are photographs of time more than of place, of what happens when a space is removed from the flow of ordinary life and left alone with its own history. The Stasi's domestic infrastructure in East Germany has followed a particularly well-documented path from operational secrecy to public memory. The Stasi headquarters in Berlin's Lichtenberg district is now a museum and research center, the Stasi Museum, where the files and equipment and operational records of the East German security state are preserved and accessible to researchers and to the general public. The building itself, a large administrative complex that looks exactly like what it is, a mid-century government office building, has been transformed with minimal physical alteration into one of the most important archives of 20th century political repression in the world. The safe houses of the Stasi's domestic network are less formally commemorated. They are scattered across what was East Germany in a way that resists easy memorialization. a flat in Leipzig, a house in Dresden, a room above a shop in a small town in Saxony. These places were not famous, they were functional. The people who met in them were not the architects of the security state, but its daily operatives, the handlers and their informants, the machinery of surveillance at its most granular level. Commemorating all of them would require commemorating every street in East Germany, which is, in a sense, exactly the point. The decay of the physical infrastructure of intelligence work is, in many ways, more interesting than its original construction. Construction is intentional, decay is honest. It reveals what was really there, stripped of the cover stories and the carefully managed appearances. The radome at Teufelsberg, deteriorating from the outside in, reveals the structure of the thing, the internal skeleton that was always there beneath the smooth white surface. The abandoned Gladio safe house in a rural Italian valley, its windows broken and its garden overgrown, reveals the ordinary domestic scale of the whole enterprise. How many rooms? How much ordinary furniture? How unremarkable it all really was when you get past the idea of it and look at the thing itself. A house, just a house, with a history it will carry until it falls down, and perhaps even after. Section 16. Epilogue. The Silence That Remains.
We have travelled a long way tonight, from the apartment doors of Cold War Vienna to the frozen platforms beneath Berlin, from the Gladio safe houses in the Italian countryside to the humming silence of short-wave frequencies across the electromagnetic dark, from the bunker beneath a luxury resort in West Virginia to the tunnel complex beneath the Wiltshire fields, from the dead drops in public parks to the rooms where defectors sat with cold tea and told their stories to people they were learning slowly and carefully to trust. What all of these places share is a quality of hidden purpose, of being something other than what they appeared, of carrying a meaning invisible to the people who walked past them, or sat in the waiting room above them, or listened to the frequency on which they broadcast without knowing what they were hearing. The world of Cold War intelligence infrastructure was built on this principle, that the most effective concealment is not theatrical, but mundane, that a safe house is safe precisely because it looks safe, ordinary, unremarkable, exactly like every other house on the street.
There is something in this that speaks to the broader experience of history itself. Most of what happened invisibly. The great events that appear in textbooks with a visible surface of a world that was mostly underground, mostly in the dark, mostly conducted in rooms where nobody was watching. The history of the Cold War that is taught in schools is the history of summits and crises and speeches and treaties, of public events and named actors. But beneath it, in the safe houses and the numbers station frequencies and the ghost station platforms and the tunnel complexes, was the history that was actually being conducted. The history that determined on a daily basis what information each side had about the other, what misunderstandings might be corrected before they became catastrophic, what vulnerabilities might be exploited, what decisions might be influenced. It is not comfortable history in the way that histories of great movements or great discoveries are sometimes comfortable. It is history conducted by real people who made moral compromises and operational errors, and who sometimes did things that cannot be defended for reasons that can at least be understood. The officer who helped an SS man escape justice because he had information about Soviet troop movements was not a monster. He was a person making a calculation in a world that demanded calculations.
Whether that calculation was correct, whether the intelligence gained was worth the injustice enabled, is a question that the historical record has not answered to everyone's satisfaction, and probably never will.
What we can do at this distance is simply look at the spaces, the closed platforms and the converted apartments and the ruined radomes on the top of an artificial hill. We can recognize what they were and what happened in them, and what they say about the particular anxieties and ambitions of the era that built them. We can notice that most of them are now quiet, that the secrets they held have been declassified, or forgotten, or absorbed into the broader texture of a history that has moved on, that the world they were built to serve has, in its most fundamental form, changed. The wall that made the ghost stations fell in 1989. The Soviet Union that necessitated the number stations and the defector safe houses and the stay-behind networks dissolved in 1991. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a long, complicated bureaucratic exhale, and the infrastructure of secrecy it had built was left behind. Some of it was immediately decommissioned. The weapons caches were excavated, the transmitters were switched off, the safe house leases were terminated. Other elements persisted, changed their function, adapted to new purposes. The intelligence agencies remained. They had new tasks in a new world. Some of the tradecraft survived, some of the properties survived. The craft of concealment, of hiding things in plain sight, of making extraordinary things look ordinary, that survived entirely, because it is too useful to abandon.
But the specific network we have been exploring tonight, the particular constellation of ghost stations and forgotten safe houses and dead drop points and border relay properties and underground bunkers that constituted the Cold War intelligence infrastructure of Europe, that network is gone, dissolved or decayed or preserved as museum pieces. The rooms are quiet. The frequencies are silent, most of them. The platforms are either open to ordinary commuters or gradually becoming rubble. What remains is the record, and the record is incomplete. The classified portions that will not be released for another generation, the files that were destroyed before anyone could read them, the memories that went to their graves with the people who held them, the dead drops that were never collected, whose small containers are still somewhere in the earth beneath a European city, sealed and silent and waiting. The one-time pads that were burned, whose messages were read once and then erased as deliberately as if they had never existed. History is never entirely available to us. It is always partly dark, partly sealed, partly behind a door that has not yet been opened, or may never be. The safe houses of the Cold War intelligence networks are, in their own small way, a reminder of this, of how much of the past is still invisible, how much happened that we do not know, how many rooms were full of things that matter and are now empty and repainted, and full of someone else's ordinary life.
But some of it comes back to us, gradually. A declassified file, a memoir published late in someone's life, a building open to tours, a platform preserved as a memorial, a photograph taken in the brief window between the wall coming down and the stations being restored. History seeps back, the way water seeps into a sealed room, slowly, quietly, through the cracks. There is something worth noticing about the geography of all of this. The safe houses we have been exploring tonight were not in the dramatic places. They were not on the summits of great monuments or in the halls of great institutions. They were in the unremarkable streets,
in the second-floor apartments of ordinary buildings, in farmhouses at the end of unpaved lanes, in the suburban parks where nobody much goes on a cold Tuesday morning. The history that mattered most happened in the most forgettable settings. History is like that often. It prefers the anonymous. It does its real work in places that resist commemoration.
Think of the people who moved through these spaces. Not the famous ones, not the names that appear in the histories, but the others. The officer who maintained a safe house in a Brussels suburb for 6 years without anyone in his neighbourhood knowing what he did. The woman who served as a cutout in Vienna, conveying messages between parties who never met, whose name appears in no document because she was never formally registered as an agent. The landlord in Berlin who rented a flat to a succession of quiet tenants for 15 years and noticed nothing, or noticed everything and decided for reasons of his own to say nothing. The Trapos guard on a ghost station platform who stood alone in the dark for 8-hour shifts watching trains pass through that never stopped, and went home afterward to his ordinary life in an ordinary apartment, and carried this experience somewhere inside him without it ever quite having a name. The Cold War produced millions of these ordinary, extraordinary lives, people whose experience of the great historical forces of their time was intimate and personal and largely invisible to the historians who would later try to understand what happened. The archives contain what was written down. What was written down is only a fraction of what was said. What was said is only a fraction of what was done, and what was done is only a fraction of what was felt, by the people in the rooms and on the platforms and at the frequencies, in all those ordinary places where the most important history of the 20th century quietly took place.
The ghost stations have their memorial plaques now, most of them. The bunkers have their guided tours. The signals intelligence facilities have their urban explorers and their graffiti artists and their slowly deteriorating radomes. The story is being told, in pieces, as the classification periods expire and the memoirs are published and the archives are opened. It will take another generation, at least, for the full picture to emerge. Some of it will never emerge. Some rooms will stay sealed forever. But tonight, in the dark, in whatever quiet place you have found to listen to this, you have been in those rooms with me. You have walked those platforms and sat in those apartments and listened to those frequencies. You have been for a little while in the hidden geography of a world that tried very hard not to be seen. It has been a long journey tonight, through quiet rooms and silent platforms and the dim frequencies of a world that tried very hard to be invisible. Thank you for walking these corridors with me. Thank you for letting this history settle over you, soft and slow, like dust in a sealed room, like snow on a platform where the trains no longer stop.
If you found some peace here tonight, some comfort in the slow and detailed telling of things long past, I hope you will consider leaving a like and subscribing to Heyo. We are working toward 1,000 subscribers, one quiet story at a time. Every like helps, every comment helps, and knowing where you are in the world, listening in the dark to all of this, matters more than you might think. Tell me in the comments where you are. Tell me what time it is. Send me your sleepy hype if you have any left. And now, let the room be still. Let the frequencies go quiet. Let whatever corner of the hidden world we have been walking through tonight recede slowly back into the dark from which it came. The ghost stations are sealed again. The safe houses are empty. The numbers have stopped. The lights are off. Sleep well. I will be here when the next story is ready.